Those people who have regularly followed me have come to expect that I like to point out some of the obvious points and even preempt my conclusions prior to their reasons. Such is the case with the Ranting Feminists Femsplaining Trigger Warnings video. I consider it my TLDR, plug intended. So let us begin. Firstly, you yourself forgot to warn your very real trigger. Video game footage is very distracting when you are trying to make points unrelated to the footage, and when the listener has certain actual disabilities. I, unlike you, won't be doing it. Secondly, given the first point and your trivialization of the actual psychological meaning of the word trigger throughout your video, I have come up with an appropriate title for your video: My Flavor of Feminist Ableism. Lastly, and to conclude, the only reasonable point to your video.
As someone with a basic understanding of human psychology,
You should defer to someone with something more than a basic understanding of human psychology, perhaps. Now on to some direct rebuttals.
hello, today I'm going to be womansplaining feminism.
Really, there's a couple of ways you could have said that different. For example, I'm virtue signaling my bias, or just simplified it into femsplaining.
Today I'm talking about trigger warnings. So I see a lot of misunderstandings online, or at least what I perceive as misunderstandings, of what phrases like trigger warning actually mean.
Yes, there is a great deal of misunderstanding regarding the term trigger warning. Trigger is a psychological term, not to be confused with the dictionary definition of trigger. Triggers cause actual traumatic flashbacks or can trigger certain psychological conditions that are uncontrollable as a result of having experienced the trigger. A trigger is not feeling upset, saddened, or in any other way simply emotional. It is not equivalent to remembering something in the standard sense of the word remember. It is to cause an actual re-experience of that triggered event. In the case where the trigger is not caused by an event, such as a psychological trigger, it is something that causes a psychological and uncontrollable reaction in the brain, which can manifest through the actions of the triggered person or their perceptions of the world around them. Trigger warnings, in the sense that you're talking about them, are not psychological triggers. They're feelings. I felt that was wrong, or I felt saddened, or I remembered something I had previously experienced. I hope this helps in some way to clear up the confusion which you and others like you are experiencing over this term.
In my experience, this has been a measure implemented in very specific corners of the internet for the sake of not upsetting people who've experienced some kind of trauma. For people who've been abused, for example, they can end up developing a condition like PTSD. For a soldier who's returned from war, people are aware of things like fireworks triggering an anxiety attack.
And here we have two very valid examples. People who have faced trauma can, and I note the word can, develop PTSD. People who have been at war and in combat can, and I re-stress the word can, develop PTSD. PTSD is not something you get from reading things on the internet. That claim has been made. PTSD is not something you get from hearing about some traumatic event. That claim has been made. PTSD is not something that you suffer because your ancestors had to go through hard times. That claim has been made. You are not distinguishing the difference between an emotional reaction and a triggered event. There is a very distinct and powerful difference between these two things. You do not need to be giving trigger warnings to people who are having an emotional reaction. They must grow up and learn to deal with their emotions.
It's similar for rape victims, and mentions of rape or depictions of it in the media can trigger an overwhelming response of anxiety.
Well, so far from what I've heard you say, there are two things here which trouble me. One, you seem to think that PTSD is the only condition that has triggers, that there are no other conditions that have triggers, perhaps, or that only external trauma causes triggers, etc., etc. I have to assure you, as my first point at the beginning of the video should have illustrated, there are other things that can be triggers and that are triggered. The second thing is this PTSD you are talking about. This soft tumbler PTSD that is triggered by all forms of media that might deal with anything related to the supposed events causing the PTSD. I'm sorry, but in psychology, that is, the psychology that real psychologists learn and practice, not the basic psychology that you're referring to, triggers are not so generalized. They are highly specific. Specific things trigger specific reactions. Triggers can be mundane. That's why triggers can be very hard, if not impossible, to warn. There are certain things, like if you didn't want to give an epileptic a seizure, you might warn about a flashing red light in your video. That's a nice general trigger warning, and effective. If you didn't want to trigger a soldier into remembering the day that his best friend died in combat, what kind of warning would you give? Would you say, in this video, there are loud firecracker sounds? What if that's not the trigger? In this video, I film woods, trees, a brook. What if that's not the trigger? In this video, there are soldiers running around with guns. But, again, what if that isn't the trigger? Trigger warnings are effective to specific people in specific situations, given specific reactions. They are useless unless you are speaking to a general population with a known general trigger. Your basic knowledge shines straight through when you make such claims or support such claims as all these general things trigger all these general people who have gone through all these very specific situations.
This isn't just specific to PTSD or victims of trauma, since there are also conditions which involve suicidal ideation or things involving eating disorders which can have their triggers also.
I stand corrected. So, not just PTSD, but any other condition which you can easily slip in or out of. In other words, the psychological conditions. For instance, your example of suicidal ideation, which can come and go, triggered or not triggered, generally is never based on triggers. And issues with foods, again, can slip into and out of, are not generally associated with triggers. Both of these conditions may be acute and therefore temporary, or at least intermittent. Both of these conditions could be chronic, and you must constantly keep a watch on them. But generally speaking, there are no triggers to them. You completely miss out on the purely physical conditions, which also have triggers. To note just a few, epilepsy has triggers. Autism has triggers. Certain forms of schizophrenia have triggers. Every allergy that you can think of has a trigger. These are purely physical manifestations of triggerable conditions, which apparently you're willing to gloss over in favor of conditions which may or may not, and in some cases usually do not, possess any trigger mechanism.
Of course, triggers are things that will need to be worked around with psychologists for most people, though some people will never feel comfortable with content discussing trauma that they've experienced, and some people will never have access to a psychologist due to poverty or other reasons.
But of course, you assume that the conditions of the trigger are treatable in any way. Your example of most people is highly inaccurate. Most people who have triggerable conditions cannot have them simply talked away in an office with a psychologist. A fair amount of those people have physical triggers, such as those people who I mentioned have allergies, or those people I mentioned who have epilepsy. The cases where people could easily find remedy with a psychologist do not have triggers in the psychological sense that you're talking about. They go to the psychologist, they express their concerns, the psychologist addresses their concerns, no trigger. People who have triggers cannot simply go discuss the problem. It is not an issue of finances. It is an issue of the way their brain has dealt with a trauma, or in the case of physical triggers, the way their body reacts to certain substances, or the way their brain was built.
The idea of a trigger warning is simply to warn viewers who may be upset by content. It's used no differently to viewer discretion warnings on the television. Triggers refer specifically to feelings associated with trauma, sometimes feelings that are triggered in relation to mental illness.
And here you are, using your basic knowledge of psychology to explain why the trigger warnings are needed. Unfortunately, triggers are not emotion-based. Triggers have a distinct and known mechanism, whether the trigger is physical or psychological. Things that make you feel a certain way are things that give you emotions. They are not things that are triggering you. Triggers cause involuntary reactions. Involuntary reactions which are uncontrollable. The example you're about to give us, that you've seen triggers for food, because some people might be triggered into eating as a result of hearing about food. This is not a trigger. Eating is a voluntary activity. Generally speaking, unless you have been triggered to eat by your hunger, you can control the consumption of food. To not do so is a voluntary action.
I used to see trigger warning food on posts and wonder why that was there. As it turns out, that is there so people with eating disorders who are triggered by images of food can avoid content that upsets them.
And as I've been trying to clearly point out, merely being upset by something does not equal being triggered by that thing.
This is not to suggest that everyone online absolutely must use a trigger warning or is a bad person, but it's a considerate action to take if you know that somebody has a mental illness or has experienced trauma and they're on your friends list on Facebook, for example, and it's just being considerate where possible.
Yes, when the advocates for constant, perpetual trigger warnings are drowning your voice out and you're the reasonable voice, then you need to find some more voices. That's the first point. The second point that I have to this is that yes, it is considerate when you have personal friends and relations that have triggers to take into account their triggers. There is no way the general person can account for every potential trigger of any other general person or group of them. Trigger warnings themselves, splashed on everything, are useless unless they're used for the purpose of virtue signaling. In the case of virtue signaling, I'm sorry, I have to inform you, because everyone knows that generally trigger warning items is useless, the virtue signaling shines right through, and everyone is aware of it.
Of course, that is a very specific trigger as an example, so it's unlikely that others will be able to accommodate for that without knowing the situation.
Now, I've just omitted the highly specific and unlikely example you've given us, because I want to make the point once again that almost all triggers are highly specific, even if the situation or condition that generated them is not highly specific and unlikely.
I personally am of the opinion that with regards to things like eating disorders, abuse, mental conditions, and anything that can be a trigger for people, if we can take small measures to reduce the pain experienced by people in these groups, it's a kind and considerate thing to do.
Well, I don't know how basic psychologists are taught to deal with these things. I'm not a basic psychologist. I do know in real psychology, the advice you have just given is quite the opposite that is actually given. You see, while triggers tend to have an uncurable nature, psychologists would like you to function as normally as you possibly can. To do that, you have to confront those things which trigger you so that you can learn to deal with those triggers. Perhaps you can teach yourself to react in some way that is more socially acceptable. They do not, except in very specific cases, where the trigger is especially dangerous to the person that has it or the persons around them. Say, avoid the thing that triggers you at all costs. So, again, while I don't practice basic psychology, I do know that your advice is in error. To be clear, I'm not talking about the kind of warnings that might help an epileptic avoid a seizure, or might help an autistic to avoid a meltdown, etc., etc. But psychologically speaking, you are talking about trigger warnings for things that either are not triggers or that a person can learn to deal with given enough exposure to the stimulus. So not only is it a discourtesy in the instances for which you are giving examples, it is actively allowing the subject to continue to exist with repairable psychological damage. I mean, at some point, somebody is going to have to draw a line. Explicit trigger warnings in case you feel bad about something, meaning we should probably have trigger warnings on romantic movies in case the broken-hearted should happen upon them. Perhaps also we should consider trigger warnings for any movie or form of media which has children riding bikes. For what should we do if a poor child has fallen off their bike and they see this and it triggers their memory and bad feeling about having fallen off a bike? In personal situations with people you personally know, it is completely appropriate to take into account the things that you know might trigger them. The number of people in your personal circle which will have these triggers will be quite small, if there are any at all. As far as warning the entire world of potential triggers, there is no limit. Literally anything can be a legitimate trigger. If you have a green screen and you film yourself in front of that green screen can be a trigger. If you say something in a certain tone of voice, that tone can be a trigger. You would literally spend so much time warning for all the potential triggers that you would have no time to present any other idea. There is a point of ridiculousness, and that point is when you assume anything that might trigger one person needs to be a general warning to the entire populace. There is no benefit, there is no courtesy, no one gains from this. So, in your personal relations, when you know someone has a trigger, being a basic psychologist as you are, please do take their triggers into consideration. Let the professionals, the ones who have studied for years and years, that know what they're talking about, deal with specific triggers for specific people you do not know. It's that simple. When talking about psychology, know something about psychology. When giving advice to the general populace, give advice to the general populace that benefits it.
In short, trigger warnings are a very simple way to let people know that you support them and show solidarity with people experiencing a kind of trauma or mental illness, generally speaking.
In other words, as I've suspected this whole time, you're advocating for virtue signaling.
Ground control to Major Tom. ground control to Major Tom.